A rookie nurse humiliated by a god-complex surgeon. An act of violence in a sterile hallway. A single, almost invisible hand signal that changed everything. Now let me take you inside St. Jude's General, where the most dangerous threat wasn't a disease. The air in the surgical wing of St. Jude's General was a carefully curated cocktail of scents. Bleach, sharp and sterile, formed the base note. Layered over it was the faint, metallic tang of blood, the sweet perfume of antiseptic soaps, and the underlying hum of ozone from the humming machinery. To most, it was the smell of healing, of life being fought for and won. To Alara Vance, it smelled like a different kind of war zone, one with cleaner floors and far more politics. She stood at the periphery of the nurse's station, a ghost in pale blue scrubs. Her posture was perfect, a straight line from her heels to the nape of her neck, a habit beaten into her by another life. She was cataloging the inventory of the crash cart, her movements economical and precise. Each defibrillator pad, each vial of epinephrine, each intubation tube was checked, logged, and replaced with a quiet efficiency that went largely unnoticed. Unnoticed was her default state. It was a state she had cultivated. In her 3 months at St. Jude's, Alara had learned the hospital's complex ecosystem. It was a food chain, and at the very top, apex predator and reigning deity, was Dr. Alistair Finch, chief of cardiothoracic surgery. He moved through the halls like a king surveying his domain. His suits were tailored, his shoes gleamed with a ferocious polish, and his voice, smooth as expensive whiskey, could soothe a nervous patient or flay a junior resident raw in the space of a single sentence. He was brilliant, his hands capable of miracles inside a human chest. But his ego was a malignancy, and it had metastasized throughout the entire department. The other nurses gave him a wide berth. They scurried like mice when his heavy, confident footfalls echoed down the corridor. They learned the art of becoming invisible, of anticipating his needs before he voiced them, of absorbing his casual cruelties like a sponge. Fear was the currency of his kingdom, and he was a wealthy man. Alara did not fear him. This was a source of constant, low-grade friction. She didn't cower. She didn't flatter. She simply did her job with a competence that was unsettling in its silence. She met his gaze with calm, steady eyes that seemed to see more than he was comfortable with. He couldn't place her. She wasn't ambitious. She wasn't sycophantic. She wasn't intimidated. She was an anomaly, a glitch in his perfectly controlled system, and it infuriated him. Nurse Vance. His voice cut through the quiet hum of the station. It wasn't loud, but it had a carrying quality that made every head snap up. Alara finished placing a fresh pack of sterile gauze into its designated slot before turning to face him. She didn't hurry. The deliberate pace was a small act of rebellion he couldn't quite call insubordination. He stood with his arms crossed over his broad chest, a patience chart held loosely in one hand. A faint, condescending smile played on his lips. Mr. Harrison in 402. His post-op vitals are fluctuating. I assume even a rookie can handle monitoring a simple recovery. The condescension was thick enough to taste. The word rookie was a dart, and he threw it often. He knew she had top marks from her nursing program, that her practicals were flawless. It didn't matter. In his world, she was nothing until he decided she was something. His pressure has been labile since he came out of recovery, doctor, Alara stated, her voice even and low. I've been checking on him every 15 minutes. His current BP is 130/85. Heart rate is 92. Finch's smile tightened. He had expected a simple, "Yes, doctor." He had not expected data. "I didn't ask for a lecture, nurse. I asked for you to do your job. See to it that he remains stable. I don't want to be called back here tonight because you missed something obvious." He turned and walked away, the whisper of his expensive trousers a parting shot. The other nurses at the station collectively exhaled, the tension releasing like a popped balloon. One of them, a veteran named Maria, gave Ilara a sympathetic look. "Don't mind him," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's worse when he's had a long day." "He's always had a long day," Ilara replied, her tone flat. She picked up a fresh chart and moved toward room 402. Inside, Mr. Harrison, a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and skin like wrinkled parchment, was sleeping fitfully. The rhythmic beep of the monitor was a steady companion in the dim room. Ilara checked the IV drip, the catheter bag, the oxygen saturation levels. Everything was as it should be, technically. But her eyes saw more than the numbers on the screen. She saw the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the subtle pallor of his skin under the fluorescent light, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand where it rested on the starchy white sheet. Her training, the first one, screamed at her. The training from a world of sand and shouting and the coppery smell of terror. It was a finely honed instinct for when things were about to go wrong. The numbers were stable, but the man was not. It was a dissonance only a seasoned eye could catch. And Ilara's eyes were very, very seasoned. She made a note on the chart, her handwriting small and neat. "Patient appears diaphoretic, skin cool and clammy, will continue close observation." It was a small thing, a seed of doubt planted in the official record. It was a shield. An hour later, the code blue alarm blared through the wing. The sound was a shriek that ripped through the manufactured calm of the hospital. Ilara was already moving before the second chime. She didn't think. She reacted. Her body knew this drill better than it knew how to relax. She was the first one in the room, the crash cart rattling behind her. Mr. Harrison was in full cardiac arrest. "Starting compressions," she shouted, her voice clear and commanding, a stark contrast to her usual quiet demeanor. The nurses who followed her in were momentarily stunned by the change. The ghost had become a general. She was on the bed, straddling the dying man, her hands a piston of controlled force on his sternum. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. The rhythm was perfect, the depth exact. She wasn't just pushing, she was manually pumping his heart, forcing blood to his brain. "Pads on! Charge to 200, she ordered, not looking up. Maria slapped the defibrillator pads onto Mr. Harrison's chest. The machine whined as it charged. "Clear!" The body on the bed jerked violently. Ilara's eyes were fixed on the monitor. "No change. Resume compressions. Push 1 of epi." They worked in a frantic, synchronized ballet of desperation. A resident arrived, fumbling with an intubation tube. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing with each beep and whir of the machines. Through it all, Ilara was the anchor, her voice the calm center of the storm, her hands the engine of life. And then Dr. Finch arrived. He filled the doorway, his presence sucking the air from the room. His face was a mask of cold fury. A code on his watch was an interruption. A death was a stain on his perfect record. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Patient went into V-fib, doctor," Maria answered, her voice trembling slightly. Finch pushed his way to the bedside, shoving the resident aside. He glanced at the monitor, his eyes narrowed. Why wasn't I paged the second his pressure dropped? He wasn't asking for information. He was assigning blame. His pressure didn't drop, doctor, Ilara said, her voice strained with the effort of compressions. It was his oxygen saturation. It fell off a cliff. I noted he was diaphoretic an hour ago. Finch's head snapped toward her. His eyes, the color of chips of ice, locked onto hers. You noted it? Did you think to use the phone and inform me? Or is that too complex a procedure? My note stated I was continuing close observation, she said between counts. His vitals were stable per protocol. The change was sudden. Protocol? He sneered. Protocol is for nurses who can't think for themselves. I expect my staff to use their judgment, to anticipate. You saw a warning sign and you did nothing but scribble a note to cover yourself. Charge to 300, Ilara commanded, ignoring him. Clear, another jolt. The line on the monitor wavered, then settled into a weak, thready rhythm. A pulse, faint, but it was there. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Ilara didn't relax. She placed 2 fingers on Mr. Harrison's carotid artery, her touch feather-light. He's back, for now. Finch looked from the monitor to Ilara, and the rage in his eyes intensified. She had saved the patient. She had been right. And in his twisted worldview, that meant she had made him wrong. It was an unforgivable sin. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. This isn't over. Meet me at the station when you're done playing hero. He turned and strode out of the room, leaving a wake of chilled silence behind him. Ilara stayed for another 10 minutes, ensuring Mr. Harrison was stable, that his vitals were holding, that the resident had a clear plan. She delegated tasks to the other nurses, her voice once again quiet and calm, the general retreating back into the ghost. When she was certain Mr. Harrison was out of immediate danger, she stripped off her gloves, washed her hands, and walked toward the nurses' station. She walked toward the reckoning she knew was coming. The walk down the long, linoleum-tiled corridor felt different. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum with a new, predatory frequency. The familiar sounds of the hospital, the distant ding of an elevator, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes, the low murmur of conversations, all faded into a dull roar in her ears. Her senses were heightened, a switch flipped in her brain that she had spent years trying to keep in the off position. She wasn't just a nurse walking to a reprimand. She was an operator moving toward a hostile encounter. She could feel the eyes of the other staff on her. They were looks of pity, of fear, of a strange, morbid curiosity. They knew what was happening. They had all been on the receiving end of Dr. Finch's corrective sessions. They were public floggings designed to reinforce his dominance, to remind everyone who held the power. No one ever intervened. To intervene was to paint a target on your own back. St. Jude's was a place of healing, but its hallways were governed by the laws of the jungle. Dr. Finch was not at the brightly lit main station. He was waiting for her further down, in a small alcove where the linen carts were stored. It was a pocket of shadow, away from the primary lines of sight, a place for a private execution. He stood with his back to her, looking at a framed print of a serene beach scene on the wall. The picture was meant to be calming for patients being wheeled to and from surgery. In this context, it was deeply ironic. He didn't turn as she approached. He knew she was there. He had probably heard the whisper-soft tread of her shoes from 50 feet away. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he began, his voice dangerously soft. He still hadn't turned around. He was making her wait, making her stare at the rigid, expensive fabric of his suit jacket. It was a power play. Alara said nothing. She stood 3 feet behind him, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She kept her breathing even, her heart rate steady. She had faced men with guns and knives and the wild, desperate look of those with nothing to lose. A surgeon with a bruised ego was just another threat to be managed. He finally turned, his movements slow and deliberate. The smile was gone. His face was a thundercloud of controlled rage. His eyes roamed over her, from her neatly tied hair to her spotless white shoes. It was a look of utter contempt, as if he were examining a particularly unpleasant insect. "You embarrassed me in there, Nurse Vance," he said, taking a step closer. The smell of his cologne, something spicy and overwhelmingly expensive, filled the small space. "You and your little notes, your little act of competence. You stood in my OR, in my wing, and you challenged me in front of my staff." "I was focused on the patient, doctor," Alara replied, her voice a monotone. She refused to give him the satisfaction of an emotional response. Emotion was a weapon, and she would not hand him one to use against her. "The patient?" He let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "The patient is my responsibility. His life and death are in my hands, not yours. Your job is to follow my orders, to anticipate my needs, not to think. Is that understood?" He took another step. He was in her personal space now, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. This was intimidation, pure and simple. He was a large man, tall and broad-shouldered. He was used to using his physical presence to dominate. "I understand my duties, Dr. Finch." "Clearly you don't," he hissed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're arrogant. You come in here with your perfect record and your quiet little judgments, and you think you know better. You're a rookie, a child playing dress-up in a world of adults." He raised a hand and poked her in the shoulder with a stiff finger. It wasn't a gentle poke. It was a jab, meant to demean, to physically assert his authority. "I am the one who saves lives here," he continued, poking her again with each word. "I am the one who holds the scalpel. You are just a glorified waitress, handing me my tools. You exist to serve my needs." Alara's shoulders tensed like an internal switch had been flipped. The physical contact crossed a line. Her training, the deep, reflexive part of her brain, began to surface. Threat assessment protocols ran through her mind in a fraction of a second. Proximity, critical, hostile intent, confirmed. Escape routes, 1, behind her. Potential weapons, none visible. She remained still. She let him talk, let him escalate, let him show his hand. "You will learn your place here," Finch snarled, his face now inches from hers. His own control was slipping. The mask of the sophisticated surgeon was cracking, revealing the ugly, insecure bully beneath. "You will learn to respect me. You will learn to fear me." "I respect the position, not the man," Alara said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. They were quiet, but they landed in the tense air like a slap. Finch's eyes widened, then narrowed into slits of pure fury. The insult, delivered so calmly, was more than his ego could bear. The last vestiges of his control evaporated. "You little," he began, his voice choking with rage. And then he swung. It wasn't a slap. It was a full-blown punch, a closed fist arcing through the air, aimed directly at her face. He was big, and he was putting his weight behind it. It was a clumsy, rage-fueled blow, but it had enough force to break a jaw. Time slowed down for Alara. She saw the tightening of the muscles in his shoulder, the forward shift of his weight, the clenching of his knuckles. She saw the trajectory of the blow before it was halfway complete. She moved. She didn't think. Her body simply reacted, a decade of muscle memory taking over. She didn't retreat. She moved into the attack, a small, economical shift of her weight. Her left hand came up, not to block, but to parry. Her palm met his wrist, deflecting the punch so it sailed harmlessly past her ear. Her right hand came up simultaneously, her fingers finding the precise cluster of nerves on the inside of his forearm. She applied a short, sharp burst of pressure. It wasn't a strike, it was a command, a message sent directly to his central nervous system. Dr. Finch gasped, a choked, surprised sound. His arm went numb, the fist unclenching involuntarily. His forward momentum carried him off balance, and he stumbled past her, catching himself on a linen cart. He stared at his hand, then at her, his face a mask of shocked disbelief and pain. It had all happened in less than a second. A blur of motion so fast and so efficient that to a casual observer, it might have looked like he had simply tripped. But Alara knew, and he knew. In that same fluid, unbroken sequence of motion, as her left hand was still in the air from the parry, her fingers moved. It was a gesture so small, so fleeting, it was almost subliminal. Her index finger tapped the side of her temple 3 times. Quick, sharp, precise, tap, tap, tap. It was a signal, a ghost from her past, a specific, non-verbal communication taught only in the most elite and shadowy corners of the military. It meant hostile contact, situation compromised, covert operator requires immediate extraction and support. It was a signal she had never expected to use again. A flare shot into the darkness of her new life, aimed at a sky she wasn't even sure was listening anymore. She dropped her hands back to her sides, her posture once again calm, her face an unreadable mask. She looked at Dr. Finch, who was now leaning against the cart, breathing heavily, his face pale with a mixture of rage and a new, unsettling emotion, fear. He had tried to punch a nurse. He had failed, and he had no idea how. What did you do?" he stammered, cradling his tingling arm. "You lost your balance, doctor," Alara said, her voice as cool and sterile as the hallway around them. The lie was audacious. It was a challenge. And as the feeling began to return to his arm, his shock morphed back into incandescent rage. "You'll be fired for this," he seethed, pushing himself off the cart. "Assaulting a superior. I'll have your license. You'll never work in this city again." He took a menacing step toward her, his good hand clenching into a fist. He was going to try again. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, doctor." The new voice was deep, calm, and carried an authority that made Finch's feel like a cheap imitation. It came from the end of the corridor. 2 men stood there. They hadn't been there a moment ago. They seemed to have materialized out of the shadows. They were both dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits that did little to hide the powerful frames beneath. They wore no hospital ID. Their haircuts were military, their posture rigid. They surveyed the scene with cold, analytical eyes that missed nothing. Finch froze, turning to face them. "Who the hell are you? This is a restricted area." The men ignored him completely. Their focus was entirely on Alara. The taller of the two, a man with a square jaw and eyes the color of slate, took a step forward. His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to the side of Alara's head, acknowledging her signal. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. "Sergeant Vance, we received your signal." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Finch stared, his mouth hanging open. Sergeant? Signal? The words made no sense. Alara gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Agent Kincaid, your timing is appreciated. General Thorne sent us, the other agent added, his eyes scanning the alcove, cataloging the overturned linen, Finch's disheveled state, the lingering tension in the air. He said you might need a ride. Are you ready to be extracted? Extracted. The word hung in the air, utterly alien in the sterile hospital environment. It was a word from another world. Her world. Finch finally found his voice. It was a strangled, incredulous squawk. What is this? What is going on? This woman is a nurse. She just assaulted me. Agent Kincaid finally turned his gaze on Dr. Finch. It was like being pinned by a laser. There was no emotion in his eyes, just a flat, dismissive assessment. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remain where you are, and to be quiet. It was not a request. It was an order, delivered with the casual certainty of a man who had never had one disobeyed. I am the chief of surgery at this hospital, Finch blustered, trying to reclaim his shattered authority. I demand to know who you are. Kincaid reached into his jacket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge and credentials. Special Agent Kincaid, U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division. My colleague is Agent Ross, and right now, Doctor, you are interfering with a federal matter. Army CID. The name landed with the force of a physical blow. Finch's face went from red to a sickly, waxy white. He looked from the agents to Alara, his mind struggling to connect the dots. The quiet, competent rookie nurse. The impossible, reflexive block. The title sergeant. The arrival of federal agents who answered to her. The entire foundation of his world had just cracked. This is insane, he stammered. She's a nurse. She is a decorated non-commissioned officer of the United States Army, currently on inactive reserve, Kincaid stated, his voice flat and final. And you, Doctor, are a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. So, for the last time, I'm advising you to be quiet. The alcove was suddenly silent, save for the hum of the lights and the distant, rhythmic beep of Mr. Harrison's heart monitor, a testament to the life Alara had just saved. She looked at the two agents, men who were a living embodiment of the life she had tried to leave behind. She had run from the structure, the danger, the weight of it all, seeking anonymity in the quiet servitude of nursing. But it seemed her past had a longer reach than she knew. Is the general here? She asked, her voice low. He's en route, Ross replied. ETA 5 minutes. He wants to handle this personally. The mention of a general arriving in person seemed to drain the last bit of fight out of Finch. He sagged against the wall, his bravado replaced by a dawning, sickening dread. He was no longer the king of this corridor. He was a bug in a jar, and the lid was being screwed on tight. Alara felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a scene unfold from a great distance. The adrenaline from the code blue and the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving a cold, clear exhaustion in its wake. She had come to St. Jude's to heal people, to find a measure of peace. Instead, she had found the same ugliness she had encountered in war zones and failed states. The abuse of power, the cruelty of bullies, the corruption that festered in the dark. She looked down at her hands. They were steady. They had saved a man's life and disarmed another in the span of an hour. Maybe, she thought, you can't ever really leave the war behind. Maybe it just changes uniforms. The elevator at the end of the hall dinged. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. The man who stepped out was not wearing a suit. He was in a perfectly pressed Class A Army service uniform, the jacket adorned with a constellation of ribbons and 4 silver stars on each shoulder. General Marcus Thorne was a man who seemed to have been carved from granite and steel. He was not tall, but his presence was immense. His hair was iron gray, his face a roadmap of hard decisions and sleepless nights. His eyes, a piercing blue, swept across the scene, taking in every detail in an instant. His 2 agents, the disheveled and terrified surgeon, and finally, Sergeant Elara Vance. He walked toward them, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. The few nurses and residents still lingering in the hallway flattened themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with awe and confusion. A 4-star general did not just show up in a hospital corridor on a Tuesday night. General Thorne stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on Elara. He didn't smile, but the hard lines around his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice a quiet rumble that was more commanding than any shout. "It's been a while. I see you've been keeping your skills sharp." The hospital corridor had transformed. It was no longer a medical facility. It was a stage. The audience consisted of a handful of stunned nurses, a couple of wide-eyed residents, and the hospital administrator, Mr. Davies, who had been summoned by a panicked page and was now hovering uselessly in the background, his face pale and sweating. The main players were set. In one corner, the crumbling monarch, Dr. Alistair Finch. In the other, the avenging angel, General Marcus Thorne. And in the center, the catalyst, Elara Vance, standing as still and silent as a statue. General Thorne's attention remained on Elara for a long moment. It was a look of profound respect, a silent acknowledgement of a shared history that no one else in the hallway could possibly comprehend. He saw not a rookie nurse in pale blue scrubs, but a combat medic who had held the line in places that didn't appear on maps, a soldier whose quiet competence had saved more lives than anyone would ever officially record. "Are you all right, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm fine, sir," she replied, her voice equally quiet. The title "sir" came as naturally to her lips as breathing. The situation was managed. Thorne gave a curt nod, a universe of understanding passing between them in that simple gesture. Then he turned his attention to Dr. Finch. The full, formidable weight of his command presence descended upon the surgeon. Finch, who was used to being the most powerful man in any room, visibly shrank under the general's gaze. "Dr. Alistair Finch," Thorne began, his voice flat, cold, and devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man reading a verdict that had already been decided. "I've been reading about you. Quite the celebrated career. A genius with a scalpel, they say. A pillar of the medical community." Finch licked his dry lips, trying to summon some of his old bluster. "General, I don't know what this is about, but there has been a terrible misunderstanding. This nurse, she—" "Be silent," Thorne said. It wasn't a command, it was a simple statement of fact, as if he were remarking on the color of the walls, and Finch fell silent. The word, delivered with such absolute finality, seemed to have stolen the air from his lungs. Thorne took a slow step toward him, his polished black shoes making no sound. "We have a problem, you and I. For the past 18 months, my office has been tracking a significant logistical discrepancy. We've been losing soldiers, not in combat, but on operating tables, in recovery wards, right here at home. They've been dying from post-surgical infections, from catastrophic organ failure after routine procedures. Good soldiers, strong kids. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the sterile air. The hospital staff in the background were listening now, their fear replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. "We couldn't figure it out," Thorne continued, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Top-notch facilities, skilled surgeons, but the infection rates were off the charts. It was like we were fighting a ghost. Then we started looking at the supply chain, specifically at the high-end medical equipment and pharmaceuticals being procured for these specialized surgeries." He was standing directly in front of Finch now, staring down at him. "It turns out a very clever man set up a network that swapped out military-grade, sterile, top-of-the-line supplies for cheap, substandard, and sometimes even expired knockoffs from unregulated overseas factories. He would bill the Department of Defense for the real thing, pocket the massive difference, and deliver poison to our heroes. A very clever, very greedy man." Finch was shaking his head, a pathetic, jerky motion. "This has nothing to do with me. I'm a surgeon. I don't handle procurement." "Oh, but you do," Thorne countered, his voice like chipping ice. "You sit on the acquisitions board for 3 major military medical contractors. You are the one who signs off on the suppliers. You are the one who personally vouched for a shell corporation based in a country that doesn't even have a functioning medical regulatory board. You are the tip of the spear, doctor, the rot that starts at the top." Mr. Davies, the hospital administrator, finally found the courage to speak. "General, with all due respect, Dr. Finch is a man of impeccable—" Thorne didn't even turn to look at him. He simply raised a hand, and Davies's words died in his throat. "Mr. Davies, your hospital has also been a victim of Dr. Finch's enterprise. I suggest you have your auditors check every batch of surgical mesh, every pacemaker, and every vial of heparin he has signed for in the last 2 years. You might be surprised what you find." The implication was horrifying. Finch hadn't just been defrauding the military. He had been using the same substandard supplies on his civilian patients, on people like Mr. Harrison. Alara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Mr. Harrison's sudden cardiac arrest. It could have been a complication from the surgery, or it could have been a reaction to faulty equipment, a contaminated catheter, a bad batch of drugs. "We could never get close enough to prove it," Thorne said, his gaze returning to Finch. He was protected, insulated, a human shield made of silence and authority. We needed someone on the inside, someone with the medical expertise to spot the discrepancies and the training to understand the stakes, someone no one would ever suspect. He took a half step back, gesturing almost imperceptibly toward Alara. "So I made a call. I asked a favor of one of the best soldiers I have ever had the privilege of serving with. I asked her to trade her uniform for a set of scrubs and see what she could find." A collective gasp went through the small audience. Maria, the veteran nurse, stared at Alara with wide, unbelieving eyes. The quiet rookie, the target of Finch's daily abuse, was an undercover operative for a 4-star general. It was the stuff of movies, not the third-floor surgical wing. Finch's face had crumpled. The arrogance, the condescension, the rage, it had all collapsed inward, leaving behind the hollowed-out shell of a terrified man. He looked at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the stillness in her posture, the intelligence in her calm eyes, the quiet confidence that he had mistaken for weakness. He had been played from the very beginning. "She was supposed to just observe," Thorne said, his voice laced with a cold fury. "To gather evidence, But you, doctor, couldn't leave well enough alone. Your ego wouldn't allow it. You had to bully her. You had to belittle her. And tonight, you decided to physically assault her. You laid your hands on a soldier under my command. Thorne leaned in, his face now inches from Finch's. His voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. That was a mistake, and it's the last one you'll be making for a very long time. He straightened up and gave a sharp nod to his agents. Agent Kincaid, place Dr. Finch under arrest. The charges are conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States, wire fraud, and for good measure, assault on a federal officer. Kincaid stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Alistair Finch, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. The familiar words of the Miranda warning echoed in the hallway as Kincaid efficiently cuffed the surgeon's hands behind his back. Finch didn't resist. He was a broken man, his multi-million-dollar world of prestige and power dismantled in under 10 minutes by a quiet nurse and the ghosts of her past. As the agents led the now sobbing surgeon away, General Thorne turned to the stunned hospital staff. His expression softened, the hard edge of the warrior replaced by the measured calm of a leader. I apologize for this disruption, he said, his voice resonating with authority. What happened here tonight was the result of one man's profound corruption. It is not a reflection on the dedicated work that the rest of you do here every day. St. Jude's is a fine hospital, and it will be finer still tomorrow. He then looked directly at Maria and the other nurses. Sergeant Vance, or Nurse Vance as you know her, has been operating under my direct authority. She has shown courage and integrity of the highest order. She saved a patient's life tonight while under extreme duress. You should be proud to have served alongside her. The validation was absolute. It washed over the staff, erasing any doubt, any fear of reprisal. He had not just exonerated Alara, he had elevated her. He had anointed her a hero in the very place where she had been made to feel like a victim. Thorne's gaze finally came to rest on Alara. The public part of the evening was over. He walked over to her, his posture relaxing slightly. You did good work, Sergeant, he said. I was just doing my job, sir, she replied. It was her standard answer, the one she always gave. Your job was to spot faulty inventory logs and contaminated packaging, he countered. Restarting a man's heart and neutralizing a threat with a non-lethal nerve pressure technique was, I believe, outside the mission parameters. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. It was, however, exceptionally well done. Alara felt the tension she had been holding in her shoulders for 3 months finally begin to release. It was over. The isolation, the pretense, the constant vigilance. It was all done. What now, sir? She asked. Now, he said, his expression turning serious again. We have a network to dismantle. Finch was just the head of the snake. We need someone to help us follow it back to the source, someone who understands both the medical world and the military supply chain, someone I can trust implicitly. He paused, his blue eyes locking with hers. I'm putting together a new task force, a joint command operating out of the Pentagon. It will oversee all critical medical procurement for the armed forces. I need a chief logistics and quality control officer, a civilian post. But I want a soldier in it. It wasn't a question. It was an offer. A door opening out of the sterile, confining hallways of St. Jude's and into a world where her unique combination of skills would not just be valued, but essential. No more hiding. No more playing a role. The pay is better, he added, a hint of dry humor in his tone. And the people you'll be punching are, on the whole, much more deserving of it. For the first time that night, a genuine smile touched Alara's lips. It was small, but it was there. I'll need to give my 2 weeks' notice. I think we can consider that handled, Thorne said, with a nod toward the administrator, who was still trying to process the evening's events. Alara looked around the nurses' station, at the charts and monitors, at the faces of the women she had worked with. She had come here seeking peace and had found a different kind of war. But she had also found that she was still a soldier, and her fight wasn't over. She walked to the locker room, the general waiting patiently for her in the hall. Her movements were light, unburdened. She changed out of the pale blue scrubs, folding them neatly and leaving them on the bench. She put on the simple civilian clothes she had arrived in, jeans and a gray t-shirt. They felt like a costume from a life that no longer fit. As she walked out of the hospital, the cool night air felt like a benediction on her skin. General Thorne was waiting by a black, anonymous-looking sedan with government plates. Agent Ross held the back door open for her. She paused before getting in, looking back at the imposing brick facade of St. Jude's General. The lights glowed in the windows, beacons of hope and healing. Inside, good people were doing good work. And inside, a cancer had just been excised. She felt a quiet, exhausted relief. It wasn't the peace she had been looking for, but it was something better. It was purpose. She got into the car. The door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, shutting out the world of sickness and secrets she was leaving behind. The car pulled away from the curb, melting into the city traffic. She was no longer Nurse Vance, the rookie. She was Sergeant Vance, the operator. And she was going back to war. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with us through that entire story. Your support is what keeps this channel alive. So if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had a boss who completely underestimated you? Let us know your story below. There's another story locked and loaded for you on the screen right now. We'll see you over there.